this session we refer to as the honorary interview. It's really my honor to be able to host this interview with Ken Gergen. As I'm, I don't want to waste a lot of time on reviewing all of the accomplishments of Ken over these 57 or more years that he's been an active social psychologist, publisher, book writer, organizer of meetings and interest groups and everything else. You can look up his prodigious resume on the Swarthmore website, and I recommend that you all do, because you'll run across, just by the titles themselves, things that you may have missed over the years and will want to read. But like so many of my generation, I first encountered Ken Gergen on the pages of a scholarly journal. In my case, the essay was Social Psychology as History, in a 1973 issue of the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. In my 2014 book, Coming to Narrative, I referred to Ken's essay as, quote, a courageous and daring act of conviction and honesty, a socially perilous kind of truth, because he was bound to suffer repercussions. For me, though, personally, it was a major turning point. At age 28, I had become disillusioned and felt stifled by the empiricist paradigm in which I had been socialized. Gergen's essay spoke to me. He was taking seriously the question, what kind of a life is a social life? A conscientious social psychology could not ignore this question and could not be divorced from the problems of its time. A social science divorced from human affairs, morality, ethics, politics, happiness, suffering, would likely be trivial, irrelevant, or useless. I took social psychology as history as an act of conscience and commitment, and it made me aware that I had been acting in bad faith, teaching methods of inquiry with which I no longer identified or cared about. Now I had to ponder, what is to come of me if I continue to act out of obligation rather than inspiration? And what's holding me back? I may not have realized it at the time, but I was in the middle of an epiphany that would change the entire course of my academic life. A few years later, I met Ken on the campus of Temple University, and eventually, quite a few years later, he and Mary and Carolyn and I became good friends who shared intense conversations, good wine, and more than a few laughs together over dinners at conferences around the country. During the last 25 years of my teaching life, I offered a graduate seminar on social construction that became a highlight of my teaching life, and in which Ken's award-winning books, Relational Being and Realities and Relationships, occupied a prominent position in my work and my life, as well as the co-authored book by Sheila McNamee, who is here to assist me in this interview, with Ken, Therapy as Social Construction. So Sheila and Ken and I had a brief meeting over Zoom to discuss how in the world we can get through this in 50 minutes and still provide some time for questions and comments from those in attendance. And I'm just going to jump in here and ask Ken to begin by talking a little bit about how he has remained so inspired over all these years, and also how he, looking back, we will be looking back and looking forward from his perspective, um, how he sees what he has been doing all these years.
Well, first of all, Art, thanks so much for allowing me to be with your group. It's a wonderful thing that you and Carolyn put together, and I deeply appreciate being here. And it's a lot sort of easier than last time, because the last time I visited this group for this particular meeting, I think I was locked in a hall between a men and a women's room because I couldn't get to a Zoom in any other way. So it's a more fortuitous moment here. But in any case, thank you for all that. Look, if there's anything that keeps this all alive, and you sort of know the answer already, it's people like yourself and Sheila and Carol and Mark and others who I know. It's in the conversations that life happens. Left to myself, I would, I could be, I would probably be in crisis. But I need others. I thrive on others, because it's partly in the conversations also that the ideas develop and hope develops and possibilities emerge. That is, you begin to develop an idea and you say, yes, well, it could do this and you could do that and it would go this. And suddenly you've got a flower garden. And that's just marvelous. I've got to add to that, it's not only the zest that's created in those conversations, but that's also wound around the relationships that you have with people, because somehow the ideas thrive on the caring of each other. At that moment of, yes, that's interesting, or that might be something to do, or just any affirmation of the relationship and the relation between you, that's where to me, the fundamental moment of emergence can be located. I've got to say that there is another part of me which is launched socially, but it's become kind of a way of life, and it's for good or evil. And that is, I have an argumentative streak, and it began basically in my early childhood because I had an older brother who was very smart and very dominant. And the only way I could protect my own being was to argue with them. And I became very good at it for self-protection. But then that begins to be a kind of way if I hear anything that seems, anybody says anything that seems very assured that they know this, there's this like red flag that goes up. That's my older brother. And I sort of begin to take offense, or at least begin to, and I can't help it. It's like, even if I like that person, if they are very sure, it's like I'm having a private dialogue that says, well, maybe. But then, and this is the part that's really important, I also turn it on myself, so that whatever I'm doing also comes with a grain of doubt, sometimes a large one. Also becomes like, I'm not sure that's right. I think there are probably other positions, and I start challenging myself. So when that early essay was written on social psychology as history, I was actually a very successful experimental social psychologist. I had a position at Harvard primarily because I did experiments, and that's what they wanted. They wanted some of the new breed. We were going to be the future. It was also Stanley Milgram was there at the time. So I'm carrying on a dialogue with myself, and you may look at that, and I appreciate what you said about being responsible, but it just built up. And when I had the opportunity, somebody invited me to write for a journal, because it never would have been accepted if they hadn't invited it. It suddenly spilled out. But I also began to reflect on that. and some of the assumptions that were built into that critique, I start questioning, and they also will end up leading to the generation of, well, let me put it another way. That critique is really ultimately, if you expand it, against positivist foundational science. It's to say what we are doing in the social sciences is not that which logical positivists developed for us, in which we were trying very desperately in psychology to make our model for the future, because that was true science and we were going to be like physics and chemistry and biology. It just wasn't working for us. But once you damage it, then the question is what's next? And partly the critique of the damaging was it's somewhat in positivist terms, not altogether. Part of it wasn't, and that was the wasn't part that became social construction as the alternative meta theory, if you will, of doing social science, which said, so look, social science is fundamentally built into the relations we have with each other. It's cultural, it's historical, it's built on understandings and assumptions. And once you do that, once you place it within us and not within an abstract philosophy, we have a lot of freedom, not total, because we're parts of communities, but an enormous amount of freedom to say, well, how is this going? And could you do that? And could you do that? And so on. So anyway, to emphasize, yes, with people, it makes it so exciting, and also with myself and with the constant questioning of myself and things, which gives me also, oh, I have to add one more thing. Ideas are fascinating. That is just to be in the swim of a set of concepts and unpack them. Not to, again, don't accept them, but realize what they imply. What would happen if you open the next door? It's like if you do oil painting. I don't know whether have you done painting, but you do oil painting. One of the wonderful things is that you combine oils with each other, and suddenly there's something new on the page you hadn't anticipated. Like it's a new combination of the colors at just the place, and it makes oil painting really exciting. Unlike watercolors, which it's like one mistake and you have to throw it in the trash. Anyway, but concepts are more like oil painting.
Okay.
And it's wonderful to unpack them and see where they go, because in doing that, it opens up whole new spaces. My God.
So let me ask, as you came to the what you're calling a meta theory, at least right now, of social construction, you had certain notions about what you were after. And in recent times, especially, you've talked a lot about usefulness, the usefulness of the work that we do, and the question of how useful it is. Looking back from now, what would you say social construction did? What do you think its consequences have been? How has it been most useful? And then also, can you see any unintended consequences? Because that's always a potential difficulty with theorizing, that you develop something that people in your own discipline and other disciplines as well look toward, and then something you never anticipated starts happening with the ideas that you once viewed in a certain way, but maybe now not so much. Reaction to that.
Could I add on to that, Art?
Yeah,
that, because I think in line with what you just said, it would be really interesting, Ken, to hear you talk about the way social construction has evolved in your own thinking and for all of us in the academy. I mean, the movement from it being strictly an academic focus of study to being a real in the world form of practice. I see that as an evolution in your work. And, you know, how did you come to that?
Okay, you got a lot of things on the plate there. First of all, once you go into the social construction, and I became, first of all, fascinated by the way in which a world you'd once taken for granted, all wrapped up in the language we have for description and explanation, becomes optional. One way of putting it. And you begin to questioning what those options are, and pretty soon you're into critical psychology, basically, for a lot of us. I want to come back to that later. But you also realize that the old model that what we would do in the sciences would trickle down to the culture because it would be applied. You know, it was if physics could make a bomb, we then would create therapies and other technologies which people would then use based on science. And that application seldom ever occurred. But once you get into constructionism, you realize the very ideas of questioning and looking for alternatives, or taking the language of construction and embedding it into practice, you don't need to have that second, do the research and you apply it. You develop a good idea and it becomes applied. It will become applicable if it's a fascinating idea. I mean, two examples, one with Sheila, and you really introduced me to this. I mean, I knew Sheila slightly before this, but she was deeply into conversations with a lot of therapists who were picking up on these ideas. So she was the one that really said, look, the world is moving in this direction in therapy. Narrative therapy is one obvious case. Why not try to bring that together, which became the basis of that book, and now she's expanded and gone in other ways with it, but suddenly realizing you had a lot of relationships with disciplines that were picking up on the ideas. So that led to another relationship with organizational development people. Appreciative inquiry came out of that. And they would do these incredible things. Then I began to think, people who are doing practical work are absolutely essential. And you've got to have relationships with the academy. We can't just be sitting here doing our own thing. We have to be in the world, because if things are going to change, it's not simply here. We've got to have dialogue that are mutually illuminating and helpful. So that's actually the beginning of the Taos Institute, was trying to work with practitioners and scholars in ways that will allow them to know about each other and to work with each other, and out of which new practices could be formed. And that's been going on now for about 30 years. However, I want to say one other thing that's more closely related to a lot of people here. You become, in terms of critique, you become very sensitive to the language you're using in terms of description and explanation. Then you begin to realize that the language we have in science for description and explanation is, for one, a dead language. You can scarcely read it. It's passive voice, neutral, and so on. Why not play with the languages? Why use that language? Right? Why use the methods we have? There's nothing sacred about experimental methods and measurement. That's up to language. So why not open up methods and description and explanation? And you can begin to see where this is leading. It begins to become fascinating with performance, multiple forms of description, explanation, narrative, autoethnography, all of that now becomes a matter of fascination. And of course, with Mary, then we've become very involved with that. We did a book on playing with purpose back maybe what, 19, I guess it was about 15 years ago, which contained a lot of that. But that also led to an attempt to instantiate qualitative methods as significant and important parts of a social science vocabulary. I mean, measurement is so narrow in terms of what it can do. If you open up to this explosion of methods which has been taking place, it's just fantastic, and it continues to develop. It's a growing era. So with Ruth Ellen and Mark, then we tried for about 10 years to get qualitative methods into psychology, and finally succeeded. And not only that, they gave us a journal, a new organization, which is having a meeting a couple of months. And it's flying. And the same happened in England, where it's, again, one of the major divisions in British psychology. And of course, the marriage with groups like yours, which are very much part of those dialogues. So that's some of it. You want,
Yeah.
Now I can tell you the negative here, and then we can come back. It started early with me because I got very involved with critical psychology, because what I had done was sort of the beginning of that. But of course, you realize with constructionism that all of our constructions are saturated with culture, with values, with assumptions about people, and so on. You can't step out and provide a neutral description or explanation. So critique becomes a valuable implement. That's coming out of critical school, coming out of Marxism, and so on and so on. But it begins to infiltrate into psychology and the social sciences in general. I mean, critical social sciences everywhere. But with not too long into that, attending those critical psychology meetings, you realize that we are beginning to get into each other's faces. So the Marxists don't like the constructionists, the feminists don't like the Marxists, and it goes on and on. And so you go to these meetings, and it's like walking on eggshells. It's like, who's gonna nip you? So the last meeting I attended, Mary and I gave a performance piece where we sang about how we were killing each other, and put it in, and it was sort of a clever song about how we were all, and it's somehow we got to go beyond that, because the world was, here we are at each other's throats, and the world is changing. We're doing nothing. And of course, it was savaged.
Yeah.
But now you see really the outcomes of that critical motive, and the motive in itself is fine. But you see what's happening in the United States with a critical race theory, in a way in which it's produced huge pushback. And you realize that the form of critique is so often that which places the target in the position of a villain. So it is really creating distance among us as opposed to change. It just galvanizes the opposition. And that form of social sciences needs to develop in terms of its dialogic potential. That hasn't been done, but it sure needs to be the next piece of the development. Okay, well, that's.
Ken, do you?
Well, oh, go ahead. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Sheila.
I just wanted to know, Ken, if you think it's possible to create a form of critique that's appreciative. I mean, to start with a more appreciative, respectful way to open the possibility for
Yeah, I don't
difference
want
and
it to go
critique.
away.
Yeah, because critique is important in some regard,
Yeah,
but the form of critique of demonizing the other leads us nowhere. So I don't know.
Well, in many
yeah,
well, I was just thinking, and this is part of my experience, in many cases, it's too late because graduate training, and I use that word purposely rather than education, graduate training already socializes people into oppositions. And you have to, you have to have a paradigm. You have to belong to a school. You have to be part of a community. And it's pretty hard and fast. And so you're asking a lot of people, especially when there's a certain degree of power in the statespeople who hold to these positions. And I mean, it's one of the reasons, and we talked a little bit about this, Sheila and I, being educated in communication programs, but not publishing actively in communication over many, many years. You, on the other hand, stuck with social psychology. I mean, your work has, moved way out of psychology and social psychology. It's recognized in many, many disciplines, as is autoethnography. But within the institutions, the educational, professional associations, boy, you are up against it. That was my experience. You are really up against it, and it's hard and it's fast. And I remember one of my colleagues at Temple saying at one point, academics talk like liberals and act like conservatives.
yeah. Well, let me comment on a piece of that, Art, and that is, look, I don't look at this qualitative move as simply opening up the possibilities for social science, and I do hold that. But what I have loved about this is it moved across all the social sciences. I mean, you go to the Illinois meetings, it's like people from everywhere. Now look at that. A lot of different methodologies, different practices, huge differences among us. And you hear very little in the way of, well, mine's better than yours, or I wouldn't do that, or that's shoddy, or that's irrelevant, or all these things we could be at each other's throats. But to me, it's a wonderful pluralism in itself, that the whole qualitative movement, in terms of its implicit assumptions, that there are multiple ways of looking at things, multiple ways that you could interpret, multiple ways of expression. There's not an ultimate, and we may differ, and you may see things that you love or don't like in various ones, but they're not annihilating. Now, if you can, once you get a qualitative movement into a department, it changes the quality to me. That's my hope. That to me, the qualitative movement's like a Trojan horse. Once it gets inside academic community, for one, students love it. One, it's more accepting of others, so it's not there against everything else. And it also invites people into its midst without that sense of who's better and where am I on some totem pole. So it's like a social movement. And I love that about this, the forgiving pluralism, which I think is fantastic.
Well, I do too. Let's come back to the question of usefulness.
Yeah.
Right now, at least the way I see things, there's certainly a struggle, a polarity, certainly in the US, if not across the world, on questions of political questions, which sometimes revolve around the question of what is truth anyway? Does it matter? And it seems that at least since 2017 in the US, although it started long before that, obviously, there's been a struggle to understand current, contemporaneously, what is happening? What is creating? You're talking about a kind of unification around we're all in this together, even if we have differences. We have the differences, but I don't necessarily see the we're all in it together. So where is, whether it's social construction or qualitative research, or just useful work, how do we broach this?
Well, a couple of things. I agree with, to me, once you sort of go into this idea of social science as a cultural phenomenon, you begin to ask, it becomes a pragmatism, not a matter of truth seeking. What can we do?
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it's a reflective pragmatism, because what do we do carries with it some sense of implicit or explicit values. Who's it for? What are we going to do with it? Who benefits? Who loses? So it becomes a matter of reflecting on values, which becomes a matter of, well, look, there's a lot of different perspectives and values in the world, and how do we move within that space? So a reflective pragmatism. Well, now, with that said, and I don't know whether you want to go back into the truth issue, we could do that if you want, but my real concern in the last 10 years or so has been with what's going on in the world in general. I mean, the precarity of our circumstances is frightening. It's like I rip through my news in the morning, I want to go back to bed. It's like one horrible thing on top of another. I mean, just today, insoluble problems, absolutely insoluble. And here we sit as a social science doing our own little things. And I think to myself, look, you've got a lot of very smart people all over the world who do social science. And we largely publish for each other, and we're a nice group of people, and we love each other, and we meet with each other, and we do things with each other. But where's our responsibility to what's going on elsewhere? And how can we continue to do these things without being engaged with those challenges? And what if you got this mobilized, this intelligence, this international intelligence to be committed to those issues? What would that look like? What would it look like if autoethnography and narrative became the major concern? Where would they be, for example? But more broadly with the social sciences in general, because we can move across that space. What would we be inventing, for example, as ways of being in the world? Now, to go back to your question, I've especially become interested in two things: forms of dialogue. And here we go back to critical dialogue has limitations. What kinds of dialogue could we invent which would have promise? Appreciative inquiry is just one of those forms. It was an invented form of solving problems. But it's by using narrative as the beginning of what I care about in the world as a way of exchanging, you get a whole different way of approaching problems, which is so much superior to the arguments we get into and the defending we have of our positions, which is so common. Where else could we do those? Where else? What other dialogues we could, and then I could go into that because there are a number of these. Um, all right, that's one of them. But the second one is our institutions have become very interested in education. What are we, educational institutions are creating the future. What is that form of education like in terms of relationship? And here I go back to relational being or relational process. The relational process is deadening. It not only undermines the potential to talk with each other, right? Because classes are top-down educational with measurement as the so we have no capacities to talk with each other and share. We're good at critique and self-defense, but we're not good at, oh, that's interesting. Wonder what we could do with that. So then become interested in how we could change, eliminate testing, measurement, which creates the dynamic of all against all, scoring, all of what comes out of the mutual depreciation, and open up classes to be collaborative, where you don't have to worry about the ultimate grading and people on some kind of scale. So anyway, it's partly developing resources of kind that we can live with, and secondly, changing the institutions so that they function in ways that would be more promising in terms of the future.
Sheila, you want to jump in here and talk a little bit about what's, I think this is related to what Ken's saying, what you're trying to do at Taos that might relate to this?
Yeah, well, I mean, a couple of things. One, I wanted to say that's related directly to this about education. Well, about addressing the situation in the world and the conflict and what can we do. I think education is pivotal there because for all of us, you know, who are educators, we have a captive audience to introduce these ideas to. And sometimes it's overwhelming, I think, for us to think about, you know, how can I confront the hostility and violence in the world? But it is under our control, more or less, to spread the new ways of being, relational ways of being, to students. And so that's possible where, you know, changing the world whole scale it seems daunting. And I think that the ideas that you write about, Ken, and that we're all engaged in are ways of changing institutions. I really agree that that's the place to go. And the Taos Institute, I guess, as we started it, was, but at that time in 1993, when we started the Institute, it was on the heels of Therapy of Social Construction coming out. Both movements, both that book and the Taos Institute, were this commitment to practice, to bringing these ideas to people who are working in a variety of domains: education, healthcare, mental health, organizations, etc., communities. And so that is our commitment with the Taos Institute. And we, you know, are constantly changing and trying to figure out what's next. How do we take this further rather than just be another repository of resources? How can we take political action? How can we make an active contribution? So in that regard, I guess, Ken, you know, I wonder what your future forming ideas are for us as an institute, as you know, think about these larger issues of, I know we've talked about creating some more activist movements by drawing on our relations and our multiple communities that are part of the Taos Institute. But I wonder if you want to address some of those, some of your thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, this is on the drawing board, but Art and Carolyn are certainly implicated because one of the ideas we're having is how could you scale up and actually use organizations like our own to do things in the world other than educate and share among ourselves. So it would be to have a consortium of organizations, nonprofits, which would make a mutual commitment to some kind of aim during the year, which would be more proactive out in the world to make something happen, as opposed to, again, the sharing and educating. So that's on our drawing board. I hope it will emerge, but we'll see what happens. And I actually be back with Carolyn and Art pretty soon about that.
Okay.
Yeah. Should we take a question, Art, from Desiree?
Yes, go ahead.
Desiree had her hand up.
Desiree?
Hi. It's so nice to be here. It's just really a pleasure to get to do this, and I'm super interested in the conversation. And I'm just going to say that I'm an adjunct, right? And so I've been out 10 years. I had a postdoc, and then I've been out, and I devise method. So I devise it. So I'm trying to figure out a way to use method, and particularly alternative methods for good in the world.
Yeah.
Right. And it's a huge project. Like it's so, and I'm looking at like being a service design researcher, and I'm looking, and recently I thought about doing research for like urban development, right? Being a researcher for urban development. And there's all these places where they will take me if I do traditional ethnography, and then I can maybe make up some kind of method in between traditional ethnography and art space research to figure it out, to tell them that would work. It's been recommended that I publish first, then go to them, with different methodologies. But for me, like that, when you're talking about this, there's a lot of people also just leaving the academy that are qual method researchers and alternative qual method researchers, that this conversation would be so nice to have with them. And then for inside the university, inside departments, inside places where, because it's also frightening, even when I say I'm an adjunct to you guys, I'm afraid, right? Because when you're not on the tenure track, people really dismiss you, And so it would be so nice for universities, especially ones with grad programs and tenured faculty and all that stuff, to open up a space for, people that are wanting to take the methods and things out into the world to make the world better, and have people feel like they still have the academic home. Even when I think about getting one of these jobs, I'm adjuncting, and I can't stand the idea of not being in the classroom anymore. Okay, so that would go so far. If any departments, especially Research One departments, would open up to people who are trained and have been sort of shunted, like I'm in exile. I talked to somebody and they said, we're refugees from the academy, right?
Wow.
If they open, and this guy's he's a scholar in Confucian philosophy, and he's working as a UX research designer for Verizon. He's a great guy too, so smart and so compassionate. But if it's not a hard ask, I think, for places that have research institutes and stuff like that. And you are nodding, you are acknowledging like all the skilled labor that's running around trying to figure out what to do next, like including people who are tenured and can't stand the university anymore. And there's a lot of them. So that's my suggestion or idea. And I'll pass. Thank you.
Just a couple of little things. One is, look, ultimately we need to change the structure of the university too, because the publisher parish mentality is killing research. It's killing intellectual development. It makes university life not worth having in some respect. It's just production. And that's got to change, or it's killing higher education. But there's no reason why public service of this kind can't be recognized. It is in many universities, but mostly lip service. Why it couldn't become a major part of what one does as a scholar, that is doing something that affects the world outside. Here at Swarthmore, that is a big part of being tenured, but many places it's not. The second thing is that a lot of qualitative work can be used outside and published. I mean, I've seen numerous articles on photo voice, for example, where it's used community development, working with adolescent delinquents and so on. It's wonderful work, and it is published. So there are journals that take this. It's not a matter of, well, I can't do my qualitative work and not outside, not be published. You can. A lot of this fits very nicely with action research, even though it may not use exactly the participatory action research.
Well, one of the things I'm thinking about in terms of this wider audience issue for the kind of work we're talking about here today is Michael Billig's last book. The last book he published on the occasion of his retirement was titled "Learn to Write Badly: How to Succeed in the Social Sciences." That's the title of the book. And that was after a very distinguished career as a social scientist. And if we're serious about evolving and changing and so forth, we have to really think seriously, and this has already been brought up, about forms, about genres, about blended genres, about the audience. If we're going to talk about the audience being something other than the 5 or 8 other people who are obsessed with the same research topic as you, we're going to have to, there has to be like really significant change there. I always found, in fact, I used to say this to some of our graduate students, I started teaching a course on writing. The last 15 years, I was in a university department. And it was, one of the first things I said is the first thing we tell, and it's come up here, graduate students is publish or perish. In other words, and that usually meant what you write is going to have a lot to do with how successful your career is. But we offer no means for improvement or practice or education in what does it mean to be a writer. And we often talked about reconceiving what we were doing, not so much as research, but as writing. And we need to have...
it goes further than that, Art. I mean, to me, writing is a kind of dying art.
It is.
People don't read very much.
Right.
The classes really ought to be in video making. You make one good video, you can reach 500,000 people. You write a good article, and you're lucky if 50 people read it.
Maybe the case, yeah.
But Ken, you have a history now of playing with writing, as most people who are present here also do.
Yeah.
And that's evolved, from
Yeah.
your very dogmatic, this is social construction,
Yeah,
to a very playful mix of sort of like vignettes. You sort of write in vignettes now, like a little bit of theory, and then a little story, and then a piece of art, and then a thought experiment, and that really seems to draw people in, I think. I mean, that's a bold move.
Well, I think, again, I love the idea of playing with writing and why we should learn one way as opposed to another. Why not learn all the voices we can, like foreign languages? And what I found is if I play with it, I find other capacities I didn't even know were there. That you have voices in you that if you just give them a chance, they can get out and they can make a show, and so writing workshops where people could contrast or share their work would be great in social science. Hey, I
So
want to try to
liberating.
do this in such and such a way. It would be really, really lovely.
Yeah, it's really liberating, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Art, I don't know whether you know it, but I guess, Carol, I borrowed a little bit from you. I did a evocative ethnography several years ago, which was a performance piece of a digital wayfaring, where I just acted as if I was wayfaring in the world, and I could just see everything and know everything. Everything was there. It was moving. I was just trying to sort of give a evocative feeling of what it's like to be in a digital age where everything is moving at once with thousands of voices and so on. The performance is not very good, but it was fun to do it. Anyway, I encourage it. Let writing workshops be part of every graduate program.
Oh, yeah, they should be.
And legitimizing those non-academic voices, or allegedly
Yes,
non-academic
exactly.
voices. Yeah.
Because if you use those voices to say what you might call academic things,
Yeah.
Their comments or questions? Mark, you want to jump in? You've had a lot to say recently about some of these topics.
I mean, all I can do is, applaud the things that are being suggested. The modes of inquiry that continue to be privileged simply don't have to be the only ones. And, as I indicated in a comment, I think one of the best ways of responding is to generate new forms, to create new forms. And all the while show how those new forms might be able to speak in more compelling ways to some of the large issues that we're concerned about, So it would never be just experimentation for the sake of experimentation, but experimentation, innovation, ultimately, and this might sound like a scary way of putting it, but ultimately for the sake of truth-telling and meaningful social reform. So, yeah. I'm off to a meeting now of the Society for Qualitative Inquiry. So now I'm all inspired to be in dialogue with them. So
Okay.
great to see y'all.
They do, Mark.
We have only 2 or 3 minutes left. But
Keith had a comment and a question, I think.
Yeah,
Right.
I might just quickly say it. Love the session, love discussion. I always wanted to ask Ken what, referring back to saturated self, which, as I say in the comments, I think was to say it was ahead of its time is an understatement of the year. With all the changes that have gone on with the internet, with comment, with critique, what might you have to say now about the saturated self? Beyond saturated? Beyond multi-phrenic?
It's a saturated self on steroids. Yeah. And what one of those things which has really bothered me when I wrote that book, I saw the possibility of our coming together because the technologies were bringing us, all the peoples of the world together. I saw that as a positive possibility, that it would mean understanding and mutual development. It would mean joining the talents and so on of the world. It was like that's happened, but it's also been the reverse. And most of what's going on the internet is now creating such havoc in terms of polarizations, alienations, that it's almost unlivable. I mean, it's, to me, contributed to the dissolution of culture as opposed to its enrichment.
Thank you.
I'd say one last word, but you don't cut me off here. It's about truth, because what Mark put it in scare quotes, sort of saying when he left. I think that's one of the things that's jumped out of into the world, unfortunately, and been misused, in my terms, because there are multiple truths. Does that mean we can just abandon the whole notion of truth? And that's not the point. Point is that there are truths within communities. We can come to agree on such and such. And in the truth is actually a derivative of trust. In terms, if you press the origins of the world back, it's what do you trust? Trust is like you will use the word in the same way I do. So we all use, let's say, mathematics. You can tell a lie, or if you exist in our community as let's say, a researcher in a laboratory, you can tell a lie about the data because we know we have agreements in that laboratory. And similarly within the political world, if something by common standards did not happen and you say it happened, that is a lie within the tradition of those common standards. In fact, it's all the worse because it begins then to erode the standards themselves. So truth in politics in terms of a general public is absolutely essential.
Anyone want to add anything here at the end? We have about, well, we're just
You
about out
really
of
have
time.
gone over time.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, that's what I wasn't sure of. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Ken. This has been wonderful. And
thank you for allowing me to be with you.
And Sheila, you too.
Thank you.
And all of you who were
Yeah.
here. I really appreciated this.